3 years ago, James Miller finished his shift at the Houston Department of Social Services and drove straight to the medical research facility downtown, just as he had done every Tuesday for the past month. The 32-year-old social worker had volunteered for the Phase 3 COVID-19 vaccine trials, believing he could help end the pandemic that was devastating the communities he served daily. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. James wasn't alone in his dedication. Rachel Green, a 27-year-old intensive care nurse at Methodist Hospital, had seen firsthand the devastation COVID-19 brought to families. She'd held tablets for dying patients to say goodbye to loved ones, watched colleagues break down from exhaustion, and witnessed the healthcare system strain beyond its limits. When the opportunity came to participate in vaccine trials, Rachel didn't hesitate. Marcus White, 29, was pursuing his PhD in biology at Rice University. His research focused on viral immunology, making him uniquely qualified to understand the science behind what they were attempting. Unlike many volunteers motivated purely by altruism, Marcus was driven by scientific curiosity and the chance to contribute to medical history. The trio had never met before entering the NovaMed Research Institute that September evening in 2020. Houston was still under partial lockdown, and the research facility operated under strict protocols. Participants arrived at staggered appointments, maintaining social distancing even in their shared mission to help humanity. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the lead researcher, would later tell investigators that all 3 volunteers appeared enthusiastic and well-informed about the trial process. They had undergone extensive screening, psychological evaluations, and medical examinations. Their backgrounds were impeccable, no history of mental illness, substance abuse, or criminal activity. They were exactly the kind of participants medical research depends on. The study protocol was straightforward. Volunteers received either the experimental vaccine or a placebo, then returned weekly for monitoring visits. Blood samples, vital signs, symptom tracking, all standard procedures that had been refined through decades of clinical research. What made this trial different was the unprecedented global urgency surrounding COVID-19 vaccines. James arrived first that Tuesday evening, September 15, 2020. Security cameras captured him walking through the lobby at 6:47 p.m., wearing his characteristic blue polo shirt and carrying the leather messenger bag his sister had given him for his birthday. He appeared relaxed, even stopping to chat with the security guard about the Houston Astros' disappointing season. Rachel arrived 12 minutes later, still in her hospital scrubs beneath a light jacket. The cameras showed her checking her phone repeatedly in the elevator, likely responding to messages from colleagues working the night shift she'd just left. Her dedication to both her regular job and the vaccine trial meant 16-hour days had become routine. Marcus was the last to arrive at 7:23 p.m., carrying his ever-present backpack filled with research journals and notebooks. He'd come directly from the university library, where he'd been reviewing literature on mRNA vaccine mechanisms. Even as a volunteer, he treated the experience as a learning opportunity. The 3 were scheduled for routine follow-up appointments with different research staff members. James was assigned to Dr. Sarah Kim, Rachel to Dr. Michael Torres, and Marcus to Dr. Elena Rodriguez. Each appointment typically lasted 30 to 45 minutes, including blood draws, vital sign monitoring, and detailed questionnaires about any symptoms or side effects experienced since their last visit. What should have been routine medical appointments became the last time anyone saw James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White alive. Dr. Hernandez later testified that all 3 volunteers completed their appointments successfully. Blood samples were collected, vital signs were normal, and none reported concerning symptoms. The last documented interaction was Marcus asking Dr. Rodriguez about the timeline for data analysis, expressing hope that the results would be available soon to help the global pandemic response. Security footage showed all 3 volunteers leaving the facility's rear exit, which led to the parking garage, between 8:15 and 8:30 p.m. This was unusual, as most participants used the main lobby entrance they'd arrived through. When questioned, facility staff explained that construction in the main lobby after hours often meant directing people to the alternate exit. James's Ford Explorer was found in the parking garage the next morning, properly locked with his wallet, keys, and cell phone inside. Rachel's Honda Civic and Marcus's Toyota Camry were discovered in similar condition, secured, with personal belongings intact, showing no signs of struggle or forced entry. The last digital traces of their lives painted a picture of three people planning for the future. James had texted his sister about weekend plans. Rachel had scheduled shifts at the hospital for the following week. Marcus had library books due that needed renewal. None showed any indication of distress, depression, or intention to disappear voluntarily. By Thursday morning, when none of the three appeared for work or answered phone calls, their disappearance became official. Three dedicated volunteers who had stepped forward to help humanity had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the haunting reality that good intentions sometimes lead to unimaginable consequences. Detective Maria Santos received the missing persons report on Thursday morning, September 17, 2020. Three separate families had contacted Houston police within hours of each other, each reporting a loved one who had failed to come home from what should have been a routine medical appointment. The coincidence was immediately striking. Three unrelated people, all last seen at the same research facility, all vanishing on the same night. The initial investigation followed standard protocols, but nothing about this case felt standard. Santos had worked missing persons for 8 years, and she'd never encountered a case where three adults disappeared simultaneously without any apparent connection beyond their participation in the same medical trial. The NovaMed Research Institute occupied a modern glass building in Houston's medical district, surrounded by hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Patricia Hernandez met with investigators that Thursday afternoon, her professional demeanor barely concealing what Santos later described as visible anxiety. The research facility had never experienced anything like this in its 15-year history. Dr. Hernandez provided detailed records of the three volunteers' participation in the vaccine trial. All had enrolled 6 weeks earlier after thorough screening processes that included background checks, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations. Their commitment to the study had been exemplary: perfect attendance, complete compliance with protocols, and genuine enthusiasm for contributing to pandemic response efforts. The security footage review revealed the final documented movements of James, Rachel, and Marcus. All three had arrived separately, completed their appointments, and left through the parking garage exit between 8:15 and 8:30 p.m. The cameras showed them walking alone, displaying no signs of distress or coercion. Each moved with familiar confidence, suggesting they'd used that exit route before. What troubled Detective Santos was the precision of their disappearance. 3 vehicles left properly secured, personal belongings undisturbed, no signs of struggle, no digital trail beyond the facility. In her experience, when people vanished this completely, it usually meant either meticulous planning or outside intervention by someone with resources and knowledge. The parking garage became a forensic focus. Crime scene technicians processed all 3 vehicles, searching for fingerprints, DNA evidence, or any trace of what might have happened after the volunteers left the building. The cars yielded nothing unusual: normal wear patterns, familiar fingerprints belonging to the owners, and personal items arranged exactly as someone would leave them when expecting to return shortly. James's Ford Explorer contained his work files from the Social Services Department, a half-finished coffee from that morning, and a grocery list in his handwriting. Rachel's Honda Civic had her hospital badge, spare scrubs, and a medical journal she'd been reading during breaks. Marcus's Toyota Camry contained academic papers, university parking permits, and research notes related to his PhD dissertation. The normalcy of these discoveries was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. These were the cars of people planning to continue their lives, not individuals preparing to disappear forever. Houston police expanded the investigation beyond the immediate crime scene. Detective Santos interviewed colleagues, friends, and family members of all three volunteers, searching for any indication of personal problems, financial difficulties, or relationships that might explain their simultaneous disappearance. James Miller's supervisor at the Department of Social Services described him as dedicated and reliable, someone who genuinely cared about the families he served. His sister Jennifer told investigators that James had been optimistic about the vaccine trial, believing his participation could help end the lockdowns that were making his clients' lives even more difficult. He'd shown no signs of depression or stress beyond the normal challenges of working in social services during a pandemic. Rachel Green's colleagues at Methodist Hospital painted a similar picture. Despite the enormous pressure facing healthcare workers in September 2020, Rachel had maintained her characteristic compassion and professionalism. Her supervisor noted that participating in the vaccine trial had actually seemed to energize her. She talked about feeling hopeful for the first time since the pandemic began. Marcus White's academic advisor at Rice University confirmed that his research was progressing well and his future prospects were excellent. Far from being a struggling graduate student, Marcus was considered one of the most promising researchers in the biology department. His participation in the vaccine trial aligned perfectly with his academic interests and career goals. The investigation's first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Building security records revealed that the Novamed facility's keycard access system had recorded unusual activity on the night the volunteers disappeared. Someone with administrative-level access had entered several restricted areas of the building between 8:45 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the facility should have been closed to all but essential security personnel. Dr. Hernandez initially claimed no knowledge of anyone working late that evening, but when pressed, she acknowledged that Dr. Richard Blackwood, the study's principal investigator, had been in the building that night. Dr. Blackwood had administrative access to all areas of the facility and had been working extended hours due to pressure from the pharmaceutical company funding the trial. When Detective Santos attempted to interview Dr. Blackwood, she discovered he had left Houston abruptly the day after the volunteers disappeared. His resignation letter, dated September 16th, cited personal reasons for his immediate departure. The research facility claimed they had no forwarding address and no ongoing contact with their former principal investigator. This revelation transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more sinister. 3 dedicated volunteers had vanished, and the one person with both opportunity and access to restricted areas of the facility had fled the city within 24 hours of their disappearance. Jennifer Miller stood in her brother's empty apartment, surrounded by the ordinary details of a life interrupted. James's coffee mug sat in the sink, still bearing the ring stain from his final morning at home. His bed was unmade, sheets twisted as if he'd wrestled with restless sleep. The mail piled up on his counter told the story of someone who expected to return. Utility bills due next month, a renewal notice for his professional license, and a birthday card he'd bought for their mother, but hadn't yet mailed. "He was supposed to call me Thursday night," Jennifer told Detective Santos during their second interview. "We had this routine. Every Thursday after his appointment, he'd call to complain about the blood draws and how the research staff asked the same questions every week. When my phone didn't ring, I knew something was wrong." The Miller family had always been close. After their father's death 5 years earlier, James had become the family's emotional anchor, the one who organized holiday gatherings and checked on their aging mother. His disappearance didn't just rob them of a son and brother, it shattered their entire family structure. Jennifer took leave from her job as a high school teacher to coordinate search efforts and pressure police for answers. She organized volunteer searches through Buffalo Bayou Park, where James jogged regularly, and distributed missing person flyers throughout Houston's medical district. Her dedication was absolute, but after weeks without leads, even her closest friends began suggesting she needed to prepare for the worst. "Everyone keeps telling me I need to move forward and find closure," Jennifer said during a television interview 6 months after James's disappearance. "But how do you move forward when you don't know if your brother is alive or dead? How do you find closure when the last time you spoke to him, he was excited about helping end this pandemic?" Across town, Rachel Green's parents faced their own devastating reality. David and Susan Green had moved to Houston from Ohio specifically to be closer to their daughter during the pandemic. They'd watched her work exhausting shifts at Methodist Hospital, coming home emotionally and physically drained from losing patients to COVID-19. When Rachel volunteered for the vaccine trial, they'd been proud of her continued dedication to helping others. "She was so hopeful about the vaccine," Susan Green recalled through tears. Rachel said this was the first time since March that she felt like she could see light at the end of the tunnel. She was making plans again, talking about maybe taking a vacation when the pandemic ended, thinking about graduate school. People don't make those kinds of plans when they're planning to disappear. The Greens hired a private investigator when police progress stalled after the first month. Former FBI agent Robert Hayes reviewed the case files and reached the same conclusions as Houston police. 3 people don't vanish this completely without outside help. But Hayes's investigation hit the same walls. Dr. Richard Blackwood had disappeared as thoroughly as the 3 volunteers, and NovaMed Research Institute claimed full cooperation while providing minimal useful information. David Green's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress. The 67-year-old retired teacher suffered a heart attack 4 months after Rachel's disappearance, spending 2 weeks in the same hospital where his daughter had worked. "The irony wasn't lost on us," Susan later wrote in a blog post that gained national attention. David was being treated by nurses who knew and loved Rachel, who were also searching for answers about what happened to her. Marcus White's family faced unique challenges due to their son's academic connections and international background. Marcus had been born in Jamaica and immigrated to the United States for college, eventually earning his undergraduate degree with honors before beginning his PhD program at Rice University. His parents, still living in Kingston, had been immensely proud of their son's achievements and his opportunity to contribute to pandemic response research. "Marcus called us every Sunday without fail," his mother, Patricia White, told investigators via video conference. "He would tell us about his research, his classes, and especially about the vaccine trial. He felt like he was part of history being made. The Sunday after he disappeared, we waited by the phone for 6 hours before calling the police." The distance made their grief even more isolating. Travel restrictions due to the pandemic prevented Marcus's parents from coming to Houston to search for their son or provide support during the investigation. They relied on phone calls with police, updates from university officials, and the kindness of Marcus's graduate school colleagues who organized search efforts on their behalf. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Marcus's academic advisor, became an unofficial liaison between the White family and Houston investigators. She described Marcus as brilliant and dedicated, someone who approached the vaccine trial with the same scientific rigor he applied to his dissertation research. "Marcus kept detailed notes about everything," Dr. Warren told police. "If something unusual happened during his trial participation, he would have documented it meticulously." This revelation led investigators to search Marcus's apartment and university lab space more thoroughly. They discovered extensive notes about the vaccine trial, including observations about staff behavior, questions about certain protocols, and detailed records of his physical responses to the injections. The notes stopped abruptly on September 15, 2020. the day he disappeared. The three families found each other through social media and mutual connections with the police investigation. Despite their different backgrounds and circumstances, they were united by the same desperate need for answers. They formed an informal support group, meeting weekly to share information, coordinate media outreach, and maintain pressure on law enforcement. "We became each other's lifeline," Jennifer Miller explained. "David and Susan understood what I was going through in a way my other friends couldn't. Patricia and her husband in Jamaica stayed up late to join our video calls. We were all living the same nightmare, just in different places. Their collective advocacy kept the case in local media attention and eventually attracted national coverage." The families appeared together on several true crime podcasts and network news programs, always emphasizing the same message. Three good people who volunteered to help humanity had been failed by the systems meant to protect them. But media attention also brought unwanted scrutiny and cruel speculation. Online commenters suggested the volunteers had been paid to disappear, that they were hiding from debts or legal troubles, or that their disappearance was an elaborate hoax. The families found themselves defending not only their loved ones' characters, but also their own motives for seeking answers. "People wanted a simple explanation," Susan Green said during one television interview. "They couldn't accept that three innocent people could just vanish. It was easier to believe they were somehow responsible for their own disappearance than to face the possibility that something truly evil had happened to them." By January 2021, the investigation had effectively stalled. Detective Santos had exhausted all conventional leads, and her superiors began pressuring her to move on to more recent cases. The Houston Police Department's Missing Persons Unit was overwhelmed with new cases, many related to the economic and social disruption caused by the ongoing pandemic. The official investigation remained open, but active resources were redirected elsewhere. The case files, hundreds of pages of interviews, forensic reports, and security footage analysis were archived in the department's cold case storage. Three families continued their desperate search for answers, but law enforcement had effectively moved on. Dr. Richard Blackwood remained untraceable. His medical license had been suspended for abandoning his research responsibilities, but licensing boards had no more success locating him than police investigators. His former colleagues at medical institutions across the country reported no contact since his abrupt departure from Houston. Even his ex-wife, living in California, claimed no knowledge of his whereabouts. The Novamed Research Institute completed its COVID-19 vaccine trial with replacement staff and submitted results to federal regulators. The vaccine ultimately received emergency use authorization, and millions of Americans received doses manufactured using data that included contributions from James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White. Their sacrifice had helped end the pandemic, but their families took no comfort in this achievement. Jennifer Miller quit her teaching job to become a full-time advocate for missing persons cases. She created a non-profit organization called the Houston 3 Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and pushing for better investigative resources. Her work attracted attention from other families facing similar situations, and she became a recognized voice in missing persons advocacy. "The system failed James, Rachel, and Marcus," Jennifer said during a speech at a victims' rights conference. But their disappearance opened my eyes to how many other families are living this same nightmare. If I can't bring my brother home, maybe I can help someone else find their loved one." The Green family relocated back to Ohio after David's heart attack. The memories of Houston had become too painful, and David's health required ongoing medical care near family members who could provide support. Susan Green continued advocating for the case through social media and maintained contact with Houston investigators. But the distance made active involvement difficult. "We couldn't stay in the city where she disappeared," Susan explained to a reporter. "Every medical building, every hospital, every street corner reminded us of Rachel. We needed to be somewhere we could remember her life, not just focus on her disappearance. Marcus White's parents established a scholarship fund at Rice University for graduate students in biological sciences, particularly those interested in vaccine research and public health. The scholarship was modest, funded through small donations from the Jamaican community and Marcus's former classmates, but it ensured their son's memory would support future scientific research. The university held a memorial service for Marcus in the spring of 2021, attended by faculty, graduate students, and members of the Jamaican Student Association. Dr. Elizabeth Warren delivered a eulogy that focused on Marcus's scientific contributions and his dedication to using research to help humanity. The ceremony provided some measure of closure for the academic community, but it also highlighted the unanswered questions surrounding his disappearance. Detective Santos never fully moved on from the case. Even after being assigned to other investigations, she continued reviewing the files during her own time, searching for overlooked clues or new angles to pursue. She maintained contact with the three families, providing updates when any new information emerged, no matter how minor. "This case changed me," Santos later admitted. "I've worked hundreds of missing persons cases, but I've never encountered anything like the Houston Three. The precision of their disappearance, the timing, the way all evidence just stopped. It haunts you as an investigator. You know something significant happened, but you can't prove it." The COVID-19 pandemic context added layers of complexity to the investigation. Medical research facilities were operating under unprecedented pressure and modified protocols. Staff turnover was high, and many potential witnesses had left Houston or changed careers by the time investigators could interview them. The chaos of 2020 had inadvertently provided perfect cover for anyone wanting to make three people disappear. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators became fascinated with the case. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries featured extensive discussions about the Houston Three, with users proposing theories ranging from corporate conspiracy to human trafficking to witness protection programs. Some theories were well-researched and plausible. Others were elaborate fantasies that caused additional pain for the families. The case attracted attention from several true crime podcasters and documentary filmmakers. Most approached the story respectfully, focusing on the human impact and systemic failures that had allowed three dedicated volunteers to vanish without consequences. But sensationalized coverage also emerged, treating the disappearances as entertainment rather than genuine tragedy. "We appreciated people caring about James, Rachel, and Marcus," Jennifer Miller said about the media coverage. "But sometimes it felt like the story became more important than the people. We weren't characters in a mystery novel. We were real families living a real nightmare." As 2021 turned to 2022 and then 2023, the case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The families had exhausted their financial resources on private investigators and legal consultations. The police had moved on to more recent cases. The research facility had new staff and new studies, with few remaining employees who remembered the events of September 2020. The Houston Three had become a footnote in the city's history, their disappearance overshadowed by the ongoing pandemic response and economic recovery efforts. Three people who had volunteered to help humanity had been forgotten by the very society they'd tried to serve. But in investigations like these, the truth has a way of surfacing when least expected, often through the most unexpected sources. Detective Maria Santos was reviewing case files on a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2023 when her phone rang at exactly 9:47 a.m. The caller ID showed only blocked, which was common for tips related to sensitive investigations. What was uncommon was the level of specific detail the anonymous caller possessed about the Houston Three case. You need to look at the pharmaceutical company's financial records from September 2020, the voice said without preamble. It was male, middle-aged, with what Santos later described as an educated accent and careful diction. Specifically, you need to examine payments made to offshore consulting firms in the weeks following the volunteer's disappearance. Santos had received dozens of tips over the past 3 years, ranging from psychic visions to elaborate conspiracy theories. Most were well-intentioned but useless. This call felt different. The caller demonstrated knowledge of details that had never been released to the public, including the exact timing of Dr. Blackwood's departure and specific security protocols at the Novamed Research Institute. The 3 volunteers discovered something they weren't supposed to know, the caller continued. The vaccine trial was being manipulated to hide serious adverse effects. James Miller had started asking questions about why certain participants were being excluded from follow-up data. Rachel Green noticed patterns in patient symptoms that weren't being reported. Marcus White was documenting everything in notebooks that disappeared with him. Santos immediately began recording the conversation, though she knew anonymous tips rarely led to prosecutable evidence. Still, something about this caller's tone, urgent but controlled, knowledgeable but careful, suggested genuine inside information rather than speculation or attention-seeking behavior. Dr. Blackwood didn't leave voluntarily, the voice revealed. He was relocated as part of a corporate damage control strategy. The pharmaceutical company had too much invested in the vaccine's success to allow 3 volunteers to derail the approval process with their concerns about safety data. The caller provided specific dates, account numbers, and transaction codes that Santos knew she'd need to verify through proper legal channels. But the level of detail was extraordinary, suggesting access to corporate records that would require either high-level insider knowledge or sophisticated hacking capabilities. "Why are you calling now?" Santos asked, hoping to keep the conversation going long enough to gather more information. "It's been over 2 years since they disappeared." "Because Dr. Blackwood is dead," the caller replied after a long pause. "He died last month in Costa Rica, car accident officially, but he'd been trying to come forward, trying to make contact with journalists about what really happened in Houston. His death wasn't coincidental." This revelation sent a chill through Santos. If Dr. Blackwood was dead, he couldn't provide testimony even if investigators managed to locate him. But his death might also mean that whoever had been protecting corporate interests was now eliminating loose ends. "The 3 volunteers aren't dead," the caller continued, providing the information Santos most desperately wanted to hear. At least they weren't as of 6 months ago. "But they're being held in a facility that specializes in containing people who pose threats to major corporate interests. Think of it as a private prison for inconvenient witnesses." Santos pressed for location details, but the caller became evasive. "I can't provide specific coordinates without putting myself at risk, but I can tell you it's outside the United States, in a country with limited extradition agreements and flexible attitudes toward corporate security services." The call lasted 17 minutes total, ending abruptly when the caller claimed to have heard vehicles approaching his location. "Check the financial records I mentioned," were his final words. "Follow the money trail from the pharmaceutical company to shell corporations in Panama and the Cayman Islands. The truth is all there in the transactions." Santos spent the remainder of that Tuesday documenting every detail of the conversation and beginning the complex legal process of obtaining corporate financial records. Even with specific account numbers and transaction codes, accessing international banking information would require federal assistance and months of bureaucratic procedures. She immediately contacted Jennifer Miller, Susan Green, and Patricia White to inform them of this development. The call represented the first significant lead in over 2 years, but Santos was careful to manage expectations. Anonymous tips, even detailed ones, rarely resulted in successful prosecutions or recovered missing persons. "It felt like someone had thrown us a lifeline," Jennifer Miller later recalled. "For the first time since James disappeared, I had hoped that he might still be alive. But I was also terrified. If this caller was telling the truth, then my brother and the others had been victims of something much bigger and more dangerous than we'd ever imagined." The families immediately began their own research into the pharmaceutical company that had funded the vaccine trial. What they discovered was a complex corporate structure involving dozens of subsidiary companies, offshore tax havens, and business relationships that spanned multiple countries and industries. Novamed Research Institute, they learned, was owned by a larger pharmaceutical conglomerate that had been involved in several previous scandals related to clinical trial data manipulation and regulatory capture. The company had paid billions in fines over the past decade for various violations, but no executives had ever faced criminal charges. Santos reached out to federal authorities, specifically the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the Department of Health and Human Services Investigative Unit. The potential for international corporate conspiracy and possible kidnapping of American citizens elevated the case beyond local police jurisdiction. FBI agent David Chen was assigned as the federal liaison for the case. Chen had experience with pharmaceutical industry investigations and immediately recognized the complexity of the situation. "If this anonymous tip is accurate," Chen told Santos during their first meeting, "we're not just dealing with missing persons anymore. We're looking at potential corporate conspiracy, international kidnapping, and organized efforts to suppress clinical trial safety data." The investigation's scope expanded dramatically. Financial forensics experts began analyzing corporate transactions. International law enforcement agencies were contacted through official diplomatic channels. The Department of State was briefed on the possibility that American citizens were being held against their will in a foreign country. But most importantly, for the three families, the case was no longer cold. If this case has already captivated you, leave a like. It helps the story of James, Rachel, and Marcus reach more people. FBI agent David Chen assembled a specialized task force to investigate the financial trail revealed by the anonymous caller. The team included forensic accountants, international banking specialists, and cybersecurity experts experienced in tracking corporate money laundering schemes. What they discovered over the following months painted a disturbing picture of how far pharmaceutical companies would go to protect billion-dollar investments. The trail began with Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the multinational corporation that had funded the Novamed Research Institute's COVID-19 vaccine trial. Public records showed Meridian had invested over $2.8 billion in vaccine development and stood to earn exponentially more from global distribution contracts. Any delay in regulatory approval would have cost the company hundreds of millions in lost revenue and competitive positioning. Chen's team traced a series of unusual financial transactions beginning September 16, 2020. Exactly 1 day after the three volunteers disappeared. Meridian had transferred $15 million to a Cayman Islands shell company called Global Risk Management Solutions through a complex network of subsidiary corporations designed to obscure the ultimate source and destination of funds. Global Risk Management Solutions existed only on paper, with no physical offices, no employee records, and no business activities beyond receiving and immediately redistributing large financial transfers. The forensic accountants identified it as a classic money laundering vehicle designed to create legal distance between Meridian Pharmaceuticals and whatever services were being purchased with their money. "This is textbook corporate black ops funding," explained Sarah Martinez, the task force's lead financial investigator. "When legitimate companies need to do illegitimate things, they create elaborate shell company structures exactly like this one. It provides legal deniability while still allowing them to purchase services they could never officially acknowledge. The money trail continued from the Cayman Islands to Panama, then to Costa Rica, and finally to a private security contractor called Covenant International Services. This company did maintain physical facilities and employed hundreds of personnel, but its client list and operational details were protected by strict confidentiality agreements and favorable local privacy laws. Covenant International Services described itself as a specialized consulting firm, providing discrete security solutions for multinational corporations. Their website featured generic stock photos and vague descriptions of risk mitigation services and asset protection strategies. But intelligence gathered through international law enforcement cooperation revealed a much more specific and troubling business model. The company operated private detention facilities in several countries with weak extradition laws and flexible attitudes toward human rights violations. Their clients included pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, and other multinational corporations that occasionally needed to manage individuals who posed threats to their business interests. Dr. Richard Blackwood's financial records, obtained after his death in Costa Rica, revealed regular payments from Covenant International Services beginning in October 2020. The payments were classified as consulting fees, but the timing and amount suggested something closer to hush money. Blackwood had been relocated to Costa Rica immediately after fleeing Houston, provided with housing and living expenses, but essentially kept under corporate-sponsored house arrest. Blackwood wasn't a willing participant in covering up what happened to the 3 volunteers, Agent Chen concluded after reviewing the evidence. He was another victim, just one who was considered valuable enough to keep alive and comfortable rather than simply eliminated. The investigation revealed that Blackwood had indeed attempted to make contact with journalists in the months before his death. Phone records showed calls to reporters at major newspapers and television networks, though none of those contacts had resulted in published stories. Blackwood's death in a single-car accident occurred just days after he'd made contact with a documentary filmmaker known for exposing pharmaceutical industry corruption. The task force's most significant breakthrough came from analyzing Covenant International Services' operational patterns. The company's financial records, obtained through a joint operation with Costa Rican authorities, revealed regular expenses for medical supplies, specialized housing arrangements, and psychological services that suggested they were maintaining long-term detained individuals rather than simply eliminating security threats. 3 entries in particular caught investigators' attention. Beginning in October 2020, Covenant had been billing Meridian Pharmaceuticals for specialized asset management services involving 3 high-value intellectual property risks requiring indefinite containment protocols. The billing amounts were consistent with long-term detention expenses, including medical care, housing, and security personnel. "The corporate euphemisms are disgusting," Jennifer Miller said when FBI agents briefed the families on these discoveries. "They're calling my brother and Rachel and Marcus intellectual property risks and assets. These are human beings who volunteered to help save lives during a pandemic." The location of the detention facility proved more challenging to determine. Covenant International Services operated multiple sites across Central and South America, and their corporate structure was designed to obscure which facilities were being used for which clients. However, satellite imagery analysis and communications intercepts gradually narrowed the possibilities. The most promising lead came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had conducted Marcus White's final appointment at the NovaMed Research Institute, contacted FBI agents in July 2023. She had resigned from the research facility months after the volunteers' disappearance and had been struggling with guilt and fear about her potential role in whatever had happened to them. "I need to tell you about the special protocol," Dr. Rodriguez told Agent Chen during a recorded interview. Dr. Blackwood had implemented additional procedures for certain high-risk participants, people who were asking too many questions or expressing concerns about the trial design. James, Rachel, and Marcus were all flagged under this protocol. The special protocol involved administering additional substances during routine blood draws, ostensibly for enhanced safety monitoring. Dr. Rodriguez had been told these were harmless markers that would allow researchers to track the volunteers more effectively. She now suspected the injections had been sedatives or other compounds designed to make the volunteers easier to control or transport. "I was told it was for their own protection," Dr. Rodriguez said through tears. Dr. Blackwood said some participants were developing anxiety about the trial, and these additional treatments would help them remain calm and compliant. "I never questioned it because I trusted his medical judgment and scientific integrity." This revelation provided the missing piece investigators needed to understand how 3 healthy adults had been removed from a public parking garage without leaving traces of struggle or coercion. If the volunteers had been drugged during their final appointments, they could have been incapacitated by the time they reached their vehicles, making them easy targets for coordinated extraction. The FBI task force now had a clear picture of what had happened. A pharmaceutical company with billions at stake had identified 3 volunteers who posed potential threats to their vaccine's approval timeline. Rather than address the volunteers' legitimate concerns about safety data, the company had hired a private security firm to permanently remove the problem through kidnapping and indefinite detention. What remained was the most challenging part of any international investigation, determining exactly where James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White were being held, and developing a strategy to rescue them that wouldn't result in their elimination by captors who had already demonstrated willingness to commit murder to protect corporate interests. Agent Chen's task force spent 3 months analyzing satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and financial transactions to pinpoint the location where James, Rachel, and Marcus were most likely being held. The investigation converged on a remote facility in Belize, operated by Covenant International Services under the cover of a private medical rehabilitation center. The compound sat on 200 acres of jungle land, 40 miles from Belize City, and accessible only by a single dirt road. Satellite photos revealed multiple buildings surrounded by high fencing, guard towers, and what appeared to be medical facilities. The isolation was perfect for detaining individuals who needed to disappear permanently while being kept alive for potential future interrogation or bargaining purposes. "This isn't a prison in the traditional sense," explained Dr. Patricia Hayes, a psychologist specializing in corporate kidnapping cases. "Facilities like this are designed to break people psychologically while maintaining their physical health. The goal is to create compliant, defeated individuals who no longer pose any threat to their captors' interests." The challenge facing American law enforcement was unprecedented. Belize was a sovereign nation with its own laws and legal procedures. The detention facility appeared to be operating legally under Belizean business licenses, making any rescue operation technically an international incident requiring diplomatic coordination at the highest levels. Secretary of State Anthony Morrison personally intervened after being briefed on the case by FBI Director Patricia Collins. The potential that American citizens had been kidnapped by a multinational corporation and held in a foreign country for 3 years represented exactly the kind of corporate overreach that the current administration had promised to address aggressively. Diplomatic negotiations with Belize began in August 2023, conducted through official channels, but with the understanding that time was critical. If Covenant International Services realized they were under investigation, the 3 American detainees could be moved to another facility or eliminated entirely to destroy evidence of their kidnapping. The Belizean government initially expressed skepticism about American claims. Covenant International Services had been operating legally in their country for over a decade, providing employment for local residents and contributing to the regional economy. The facility's operations appeared legitimate from the perspective of local authorities who had conducted routine inspections. However, when FBI agents shared specific financial evidence linking the facility to the kidnapping of American citizens, Belizean officials agreed to cooperate with a joint investigation. The evidence was overwhelming. Payments from Meridian Pharmaceuticals through shell companies to Covenant International Services, specifically earmarked for the detention of 3 high-value intellectual property risks from Houston, Texas. The joint operation was classified as a humanitarian rescue mission rather than a law enforcement raid, which allowed it to proceed without extensive international legal procedures that could have taken years to complete. A combined team of FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and Belizean police planned a coordinated approach to the facility. On September 12, 2023, almost exactly 3 years after the volunteers' disappearance, the rescue operation commenced at dawn. The tactical team approached the compound from multiple directions, expecting armed resistance from private security personnel who had been maintaining the facility for Covenant International Services. What they found instead was a largely abandoned compound with only minimal security presence. Intelligence suggested that Covenant had begun relocating operations and personnel several weeks earlier, possibly in response to increased scrutiny from international law enforcement agencies. Agent Chen led the team that searched the main detention building. They discovered evidence of long-term human habitation, modified living quarters with reinforced doors and windows, medical examination rooms equipped with restraint devices, and extensive documentation of psychological evaluation and behavioral modification programs. In a secure file room, investigators found detailed records of the facility's operations dating back to 2015. The documentation revealed that Covenant International Services had been detaining individuals on behalf of corporate clients for nearly a decade, with victims including journalists, researchers, whistleblowers, and regulatory officials who had posed threats to various business interests. The files contained specific entries for assets H1, H2, and H3, the clinical designations assigned to James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White. The records documented their initial processing, medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and behavioral responses to various containment protocols over the past 3 years. Reading those files was horrifying, Agent Chen later testified before a congressional oversight committee. These were detailed scientific studies of how to break human beings psychologically while keeping them physically healthy. It was systematic torture disguised as behavioral research. The most encouraging discovery was a notation indicating that all 3 Houston volunteers had been transferred to another facility just 2 weeks earlier. The records showed they were still alive as of August 30th, 2023, and had been moved to what the files described as Final Processing Facility, Guatemala Operations. Intelligence analysts immediately began searching for Covenant International Services operations in Guatemala. The trail led to another remote compound, this one located in the mountainous interior near the Mexican border. Unlike the Belize facility, which had been designed for long-term detention, the Guatemala site appeared to be a processing center for individuals being prepared for permanent elimination. Time was now critically short. If the 3 volunteers had been moved to Guatemala for final processing, they might have only days or weeks before being murdered to eliminate evidence of their kidnapping. The discovery that they were still alive after 3 years provided hope, but also highlighted the urgent need for immediate action. Diplomatic negotiations with Guatemala proved more complex than those with Belize. The Guatemalan government was less cooperative, citing concerns about sovereignty and the precedent of allowing foreign law enforcement operations on their territory. Covenant International Services also appeared to have stronger political connections in Guatemala, making official cooperation more difficult to secure. Agent Chen's team prepared for the possibility that the Guatemala rescue operation would need to proceed through unofficial channels, potentially with assistance from private military contractors rather than local law enforcement agencies. The moral imperative of saving 3 innocent American citizens was beginning to outweigh concerns about international legal niceties. We had credible evidence that 3 Americans were being held against their will and facing imminent execution, Chen later explained. At that point, every day of delay potentially meant the difference between rescue and recovery of bodies. The diplomatic process was too slow for the reality we were facing. As September 2023 progressed toward October, the rescue operation entered its most critical and dangerous phase. The Guatemala operation required a level of secrecy and coordination that pushed American law enforcement to its limits. Unlike the Belize rescue, which had proceeded with official government cooperation, the Guatemala mission would need to rely on intelligence sharing with private security contractors and undercover coordination with sympathetic elements within the Guatemalan military. Agent Chen worked with a specialized unit within the FBI's hostage rescue team, supplemented by former special operations personnel who had experience with international extraction missions. The team included medical personnel prepared to treat victims who had endured 3 years of captivity and possible psychological conditioning designed to prevent escape attempts. Satellite surveillance of the Guatemala facility revealed a much more heavily fortified compound than the Belize location. The site included multiple guard towers, perimeter security systems, and what appeared to be underground detention facilities carved into the mountainous terrain. Intelligence estimates suggested a security force of at least 20 armed personnel, all with military backgrounds and loyal to Covenant International Services. This wasn't going to be a humanitarian rescue mission, Chen acknowledged during later congressional testimony. We were planning a military-style assault on a fortified position held by trained professionals who would kill the hostages rather than allow them to be rescued and testify about their experiences. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source within Guatemala itself. Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who provided chaplain services to various detention facilities throughout the country, made contact with American authorities through church channels. He had been ministering to prisoners at the Covenant facility and had recognized that some detainees appeared to be American citizens being held against their will. "I couldn't remain silent about what I witnessed," Father Santos later explained through a translator. These people were not criminals or terrorists. They were clearly victims, and their captors were conducting psychological experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. Father Santos provided detailed intelligence about the facility's layout, security procedures, and the condition of the American detainees. His information confirmed that James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White were alive, but had endured significant psychological trauma during their 3 years of captivity. The priest described James as physically healthy, but exhibiting symptoms of severe depression and learned helplessness. Rachel had maintained better psychological resilience, possibly due to her medical training and understanding of what was being done to them. Marcus had been the most resistant to psychological conditioning and had been subjected to more intensive behavioral modification procedures as a result. Mr. White kept detailed records, Father Santos reported. He had somehow acquired writing materials and was documenting everything that happened to them. The guards didn't know about his record keeping, but he showed me pages of notes hidden in his cell. He was determined that if they died, there would be evidence of what had been done to them. This intelligence proved crucial for planning the rescue operation. Marcus's hidden documentation could provide legal evidence for prosecuting those responsible for the kidnapping, but only if the rescue team could locate and preserve his records during the extraction process. The operation commenced on October 15, 2023, during the early morning hours when security personnel would be at minimum staffing levels. The rescue team approached the compound through mountainous terrain that provided natural concealment but also made rapid evacuation more challenging. Agent Chen led one team that approached the main detention building, while a second team secured the perimeter and a third team prepared medical evacuation helicopters at a landing zone 2 miles from the compound. The mission timeline allowed for no more than 30 minutes from initial breach to full evacuation. The assault began with coordinated strikes on the facility's communication systems and power grid, designed to prevent guards from calling for reinforcements or implementing protocols for eliminating the hostages. The rescue team encountered heavier resistance than anticipated, with security personnel who appeared to have been expecting some form of law enforcement action. "They were ready for us," Agent Chen later reported. Someone had warned them that American authorities were closing in. The guards had prepared defensive positions and had moved the hostages to a more secure location within the compound. This wasn't the surprise operation we had planned. Despite the increased resistance, the rescue team successfully breached the main detention building and located the 3 American hostages in an underground holding area. James, Rachel, and Marcus were found in separate cells, physically restrained but conscious and aware of what was happening around them. The reunion was both heartbreaking and inspiring. All 3 volunteers were significantly thinner than they had been 3 years earlier, showing signs of chronic stress and psychological trauma. But they were alive, alert, and able to walk with assistance to the evacuation helicopters. Marcus White had indeed maintained detailed records of their captivity, hidden in various locations throughout his cell. The rescue team was able to recover several notebooks containing descriptions of their kidnapping, the psychological procedures they had endured, and the corporate connections they had discovered through overheard conversations between their guards and supervisors. "Marcus never stopped being a scientist," Rachel Green said during her first interview with investigators. "Even under those conditions, he was gathering evidence and documenting everything. He kept telling us that someday someone would come looking for us, and we needed to have proof of what had been done." The evacuation proceeded under hostile fire from security personnel who attempted to prevent the rescue helicopters from leaving Guatemalan airspace. Military jets from the U.S. Southern Command provided escort protection during the flight to safety, marking the first time in decades that American military assets had been used to protect citizens rescued from corporate kidnapping operations. James, Rachel, and Marcus were transported to a secure medical facility at an undisclosed location, where they could receive treatment for their physical and psychological trauma while being debriefed by investigators about their 3 years of captivity. Their testimonies would provide the evidence needed to prosecute not only Covenant International Services, but also Meridian Pharmaceuticals and the corporate executives who had authorized their kidnapping. The rescue operation's success marked the end of their captivity, but it was only the beginning of a much larger legal and political battle to hold accountable the corporate interests that had treated 3 American volunteers as disposable obstacles to their billion-dollar vaccine profits. The 3 families, who had never given up hope despite 3 years of uncertainty and grief, finally received the news they had prayed for. Their loved ones were coming home. The return of James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White to American soil on October 16, 2023, marked the beginning of the largest corporate accountability investigation in modern history. Their testimonies, combined with Marcus's detailed documentation and the financial evidence gathered by Agent Chen's task force, exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of pharmaceutical industry leadership. Jennifer Miller's first embrace with her brother James at the secure medical facility was captured by a single photographer granted access to the reunion. The image, James, visibly thinner but smiling through tears, holding his sister as she sobbed with relief, became a symbol of both corporate cruelty and the power of family persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. "I never stopped believing he was alive," Jennifer later told reporters. "Even when everyone said I should prepare for the worst, even when the investigation went cold, I knew James was out there somewhere needing us to find him." The hardest part was not knowing if we were running out of time. The medical evaluation of all three survivors revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation they had endured during their captivity. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the psychiatrist overseeing their care, described their treatment as systematic psychological warfare, designed to break their will, to resist or escape while maintaining their cognitive function for potential future interrogation. All three had been subjected to isolation, sleep deprivation, and conditioning techniques designed to create dependency on their captors. They had been told their families had given up searching for them, that the vaccine trial had been cancelled due to their irresponsible actions, and that they would never be allowed to return to their previous lives. The psychological torture was worse than any physical abuse, Rachel Green testified during a closed congressional hearing. "They wanted us broken, compliant, grateful for basic human treatment. They nearly succeeded. If not for Marcus keeping records and James maintaining hope, we might have eventually believed their version of reality." Marcus White's hidden notebooks proved to be the key evidence that investigators needed to build criminal cases against multiple corporate executives. His scientific training had led him to document not only their daily treatment, but also conversations between guards, visits from corporate representatives, and details about other detainees who had been processed through the facility. Marcus turned his captivity into a research project, Agent Chen marveled during a briefing with federal prosecutors. He was gathering intelligence on a multinational criminal organization from inside their detention facility. His records provide evidence of criminal activity spanning multiple countries and affecting dozens of victims beyond just the Houston Three. The prosecution of Meridian Pharmaceuticals and its executives began in January 2024, with federal charges including kidnapping, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and violations of clinical trial regulations. The company's initial response was to claim ignorance of Covenant International Services methods, arguing that they had merely hired a security consultant to locate missing research participants. This defense collapsed when prosecutors revealed recorded conversations between Meridian executives and Covenant personnel discussing permanent containment protocols and asset elimination procedures. Udulm, the pharmaceutical company's leadership, had not only known about the kidnapping, but had actively participated in planning the volunteers' detention and potential murder. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the former NovaMed Research Institute director, became a key prosecution witness after agreeing to testify in exchange for immunity. Her testimony revealed that Meridian Pharmaceuticals had pressured research facilities to suppress reports of adverse vaccine reactions and to eliminate participants who might interfere with the regulatory approval timeline. "We were told that the greater good required some individual sacrifices," Dr. Hernandez testified through tears. "I thought that meant asking volunteers to accept some discomfort or inconvenience for the sake of ending the pandemic. I never imagined it meant kidnapping and torture." The trial attracted international attention as the first major prosecution of pharmaceutical executives for kidnapping researchers who had discovered safety issues with their products. Legal experts described it as a watershed moment in corporate accountability, with potential implications for how multinational companies conduct business in countries with weak law enforcement systems. Covenant International Services proved more difficult to prosecute due to the international nature of their operations and their use of shell companies to obscure ownership and responsibility. However, the company's founder, Michael Davidson, was arrested in Panama and extradited to the United States to face charges related to the Houston 3 case and dozens of other corporate kidnapping operations spanning nearly a decade. Davidson created an entire industry around disappearing inconvenient people for corporate clients, explained federal prosecutor Sarah Martinez. His company didn't just detain James, Rachel, and Marcus. They were running a multinational operation that eliminated threats to major corporations by kidnapping, imprisoning, and sometimes murdering journalists, researchers, and whistleblowers. The 3 families became advocates for stronger protections for clinical trial participants and researchers who discover safety issues with experimental treatments. Jennifer Miller's Houston 3 Foundation expanded its mission to include supporting families of corporate kidnapping victims and pushing for international treaties that would prevent companies from using private detention facilities to silence critics. Our loved ones were nearly lost forever because they tried to do the right thing, Jennifer said during a speech to medical researchers. We can't let that happen to other families. Pharmaceutical companies need to know that harming research participants will result in consequences that far outweigh any financial benefits they might gain. The Belizean and Guatemalan governments faced international pressure to investigate their oversight of private detention facilities operating within their borders. Both countries ultimately passed legislation requiring more stringent monitoring of foreign-operated security companies and detention facilities, with regular inspections by international human rights organizations. James Miller returned to work at the Houston Department of Social Services, though he now focuses on helping families navigate complex bureaucratic systems, skills he developed during his own family's fight to find him. His experience as a kidnapping victim has given him unique insight into the challenges faced by families dealing with missing persons cases and corporate accountability issues. I understand now what my clients go through when they feel like the system is designed to defeat them, James reflected during an interview on the first anniversary of his rescue. The difference is that I had a sister who never gave up and investigators who eventually listened. Not everyone has that support. Rachel Green completed her recovery and returned to nursing, but now works specifically with trauma survivors and families of missing persons. Her medical training, combined with her experience as a kidnapping victim, has made her uniquely qualified to help others process the psychological impact of prolonged uncertainty and trauma. Healing isn't just about recovering from what happened to you, Rachel explained during a conference on trauma recovery. It's about finding meaning in your survival and using your experience to help prevent others from going through the same ordeal. Marcus White finished his PhD dissertation while recovering from his captivity, focusing his research on ethical issues in pharmaceutical clinical trials and corporate responsibility in medical research. His hidden notebooks from captivity became the foundation for a book about corporate kidnapping that is scheduled for publication next year. Science is supposed to help humanity, not exploit it, Marcus said during his doctoral defense. My experience showed me how easily research can be corrupted when corporate profits become more important than human lives. We need better systems to protect researchers and participants who try to do the right thing. The Meridian Pharmaceuticals executives ultimately received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in federal prison. The company itself paid over $7 billion in fines and was required to establish a victim compensation fund for the Houston 3 and other individuals harmed by their criminal conspiracy. Michael Davidson and other Covenant International Services personnel received life sentences for their roles in multiple kidnapping and murder cases spanning several countries. The company's assets were seized and liquidated, with proceeds distributed to victims' families and organizations working to prevent corporate-sponsored human rights abuses. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting multinational corporations that use private security firms to commit crimes against researchers, journalists, and other individuals who threaten their business interests. International law enforcement agencies now have better frameworks for investigating and prosecuting corporate kidnapping cases that cross national boundaries. For the three families who had endured 3 years of uncertainty and grief, the successful prosecution provided a measure of justice, but more importantly, it ensured that their loved one's sacrifice had meaning beyond their personal ordeal. James, Rachel, and Marcus didn't just survive their captivity, Jennifer Miller said during the final press conference after all legal proceedings had concluded. They exposed a system of corporate criminality that was harming people all over the world. Their courage, while being held prisoner, helped bring down an entire network of companies that thought they could make people disappear without consequences. The Houston 3 case became a landmark in the fight against corporate impunity, demonstrating that even the most powerful multinational companies could be held accountable when they chose profits over human lives. 3 volunteers who had simply wanted to help end a pandemic had ultimately helped expose and dismantle a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Their story serves as both a warning about corporate power and a testament to the importance of never giving up on missing loved ones, no matter how hopeless the situation might appear. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases throughout America. Thank you for following the story of James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White. We'll see you in the next video. The Houston 3 case represents more than just a successful rescue operation or corporate prosecution. It reveals the lengths to which multinational companies will go to protect billion-dollar investments and the courage required by ordinary people to stand against institutional power when human lives are at stake. James Miller, Rachel Green, and Marcus White volunteered to help end a global pandemic. Their reward was 3 years of captivity, psychological torture, and the constant threat of death. But their survival and the exposure of the criminal conspiracy that targeted them has created safeguards that will protect future researchers and clinical trial participants from similar corporate retaliation. Their families' refusal to accept official explanations and their persistent advocacy for answers ultimately saved not just 3 lives, but potentially dozens of other victims who might have been targeted by the same criminal network. The case demonstrates that even in an era of corporate power and institutional failure, individual courage and family love can still triumph over systematic evil. The truth, as it always does, eventually surfaced, bringing justice to those who thought they were above the law and redemption to 3 people who had nearly been erased from existence for trying to do the right thing.